Hello there, we're in Tranent and today we're going to walk a very short distance, just about a mile or two, into Prestonpans. Now when you think of the name Prestonpans, it's very hard not to also think of the Battle of Prestonpans, and we'll visit various parts of the battlefield. There are some information panels and things to see along the way. So that's the plan for today. But having just come out of Tranent, you may have noticed that there's quite a few street cameras, security cameras in the streets. And you might have cause to wonder what they're there for, because Tranent's just a wee place. Well, I'll let you into a secret. It's to make sure the Jacobites don't come back. But they haven't spotted me. When Prince Charles Edward Stuart and the Jacobite army arrived in Tranent, on the high ground of Bursley Brae, or between there and the west of the town, they were on a roll. The Prince had raised his standard at Glenfinnan, the army had marched south, sweeping through Perth, and it marched triumphantly into Edinburgh. But here at Prestonpans, just on the lower ground between Preston and Seaton, was a government army whose sole intention was to stop them in their tracks. Having got themselves up to the high ground of Bursley Brae, which is in that direction, the Jacobite army realised that the high ground, which is normally an advantage in a battle situation, was of no advantage at all, because it was just impractical and impossible for them to carry out any sort of assault or charge down the slope and across the land just at the foot of it. So a man appeared. There's always a man involved, a local man who knew the area and knew that there was a track or a defile in this direction which would allow them to pass through a boggy section and take them round towards the east of the government forces, so just in this direction, and take them near Seaton. But I mean, during all this time and the build up to the battle, the day before and in the very early morning of the actual day of the battle, government forces under the command of General John Cope were constantly changing position, trying to anticipate the direction that the Jacobites would come from. First, they were facing west. Then, when they realised that the Jacobites had got themselves up onto the high ground of Bursley Brae, they faced south. And then, in the small hours of the morning, very early morning on the day of the battle, they suddenly realised that the Jacobites had suddenly got themselves over here, so that the government forces once again changed position. And in many respects, you could say that at this point the Jacobites were running rings around the government forces. This is roughly where the two armies faced each other in the very early morning of the 21st of September 1745. As I had perhaps said earlier, the Jacobites had taken themselves down off the high ground that they were on the previous evening and arranged themselves on the battlefield just over there, just sort of that side of the camera and perhaps the other side of the small road there. Government forces were essentially just sort of here. And as I also previously said, the government forces were constantly trying to anticipate from which direction the Jacobites would advance from. And they were changing direction quite a few times, and thankfully just managed to get a hint of what was going on, and only just in time managed to organise their forces and their units so that they were facing east and they were facing in the direction that the Jacobites were coming from. But the problem, one of the problems that Cope had was in just trying to figure out when the Jacobites would actually charge. I mean, he was set up on flat ground with his cannons, not that many men to look after him, right enough. You know, so he was quite happy to sit where he was and wait. Colonel James Gardner, who was in charge of the 13th Dragoons, he wasn't for waiting. He sensed that all was not well, and he was wanting to have a go at the Jacobites the previous evening. How he was going to do that, I'm not entirely sure, given that they were up on the ridge. But he sensed that all was not well, and he just wanted to be up and at them. Cope wasn't for having that, and he demanded that the British Army just waited here. And it was a mistake, because if they had done what Colonel Gardner had suggested, this could have gone a different way. Many things went badly wrong for the government forces on this day. For a start, I mean, when the Jacobites arranged themselves just over here in their various units, I mean, it was barely light, you know, September. There might have been a bit of early morning ground mist obscuring things, and it was hard to see exactly what was going on. For both sides, One of the Jacobite units, in the poor light, somehow arranged themselves not quite facing the government forces, but sort of to the side of them, you might say, or at least in a position that led the Cope to wonder what the heck was going on, because it looked to him as if part of his army were actually Jacobites. And he came to think that the Jacobite army was double the size that it actually was. I mean, that in itself would have sent a ripple through the government forces and would have made them kind of wonder a bit, you know. But it wasn't just that. While government forces had cannon, they didn't have that many cannon, and as soon as the men who were in charge of moving the cannon saw the Highlanders through the mist, they ran. So the cannon were pretty much, you know, where they were. They weren't going to be doing any moving at all. And when the Highlanders eventually charged, and we're talking about, as I say, early morning, bit of mist, the government soldiers managed to fire off a musket volley. One guy managed to fire off a few of the cannon before taking to his heels. And the Jacobites themselves managed to fire their muskets, which they immediately discarded, drew their swords and ran hell for leather towards the government forces, who, having fired their own guns, immediately took to their heels. Not all of them, there was fighting, a lot of men died, but on the whole they just turned heels and ran. And they ran in the direction of Preston.
Colonel James Gardner was not for running. He was in charge of the 13th Dragoons, a government regiment of cavalry that had already fled Edinburgh when Jacobites took the city. Gardner lived in Bankton House, and so was effectively fighting in his own back garden. During the opening minutes of the battle, he received 2 bullet wounds, but instead of fleeing the battle with the rest of his regiment, he returned to provide support to a group of foot soldiers still engaged in fighting. I shall now read from a contemporary account of what happened next. A Highlander advanced towards him with a scythe fastened on a long pole, with which he gave such a deep wound on his right arm that his sword dropped out of his hand. At the same time, several others, coming about him while he was thus dreadfully entangled with that cruel weapon, he was dragged off his horse. The moment he fell, another Highlander gave him a stroke, either with a broadsword or a Lochaber axe, on the hinder part of his head, which was the mortal blow.
Many of the government soldiers fleeing from the battle ended up in the grounds of Preston House, which is just a very short distance over there. I think it's where the old community centre currently stands. I think the wall around it has been cut down in height from what it used to be when it was the wall around Preston House. This is the grounds of Preston Tower, which is just behind the camera there. This is a ducat, not the tower. And you can maybe see that the wall is a significant height, and I think even here it's been cut down in places and may have been just a little bit higher. And this maybe give you an idea of perhaps how high the wall around Preston House may once have been. And if you found yourself in here trying to escape a battle, you'd be struggling to get back out again. For the government troops whose flight took them into the grounds of Preston House, the walls were so high that there was no escape, and many were slaughtered when the Jacobites caught up with them. I'm not certain, but perhaps at one time this wall that surrounds Preston Tower may have been part of the same wall that surrounded Preston House, which, as I say, is almost a spit away in that direction. And it's just so hard to imagine such a thing happening in a bit of ground that is now so utterly peaceful. I'm in the Gothenburg pub, or the Goth, in the main street in Prestonpans. Just upstairs you'll find a number of paintings by Andrew Hillhouse, the late Andrew Hillhouse, depicting various events during the Battle of Prestonpans. This one, for example, is called "The Camerons Charge and Take the Redcoat Cannons." Seriously good paintings depicting real events during the battle. Although the Battle of Prestonpans lasted at the most 15 minutes, during that short savage period of time, over 300 men died and over 500 were injured. And it's important that we never forget these things. It's also important that battle sites like the one at Prestonpans are preserved for future generations and really for all time coming. I'm Eddie Burns. I'll see you again.